Welcome to All Things Social Security. Enjoy your video. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Stephanie Joy with Joy Disability and All Things Social Security here on YouTube. Just going to go over what I was just discussing with somebody in terms of trying to explain the concept of transferable skills, which is something that has to be considered by the SSA in the sequential evaluation process it goes through to determine if someone is disabled under the rules or not disabled under the rules. Generally, it comes into play. I want to say, well, I don't even want to say which step, 3, 4, 5, because under 4 is where they determine whether you can do your prior job. And at that point, they have to determine what that prior job is. And I think it's then that they have to determine whether there's transferable skills. Because if you can't do that job on step 4, you haven't won the battle yet because you have to be able to prove that you can't do any other job under step 5. And that's where transferable skills comes in, because if you have skills that you learned on your job, but you can't do that job because it's too physically arduous, maybe it's a medium exertional level and you're reduced to light or sedentary, then do you have transferable skills that you learned on that job that you could then use to go into a different job at that light or sedentary exertional level that you could do? So let's go into a little bit more. A lot of people overall wonder how the SSA decides if someone can still work even when they have really serious health problems. So what we have to know is that the SSA doesn't just look at the jobs you can't do anymore. They also look at what skills you might still have from past jobs, like I was saying, that could then transfer to that new work. Transferable skills, kind of in a nutshell, is the skills that you learned from the past work. And the past work, as you know, is now the 5 year look back period, usually from the date that's being adjudicated at any given time. That could be the initial adjudicator, the recon adjudicator, or the ALJ. So whenever they're going through the process, they look at 5 years before that. Anything that's more than 5 years prior, they can't consider those skills as transferable. So they look at those skills, see what's there, and determine whether those skills can be used in a different job. And then they move forward from that point. So going through a little outline here, the skills are what's going to allow you to adjust to other work if those skills are transferable, i.e. adjustable to other work. For example, if there's a construction supervisor who can't do the physical work, he might still have management and planning skills that could be used for the office jobs. So, you might say, well, I can't do anything in construction. I'm too physically impaired. But those learned skills, which come from skilled or semi-skilled jobs, they don't come from unskilled jobs. But those skills as a construction supervisor, which wouldn't be skills gained by a construction worker, can be potentially transferable. Now, just because they're transferable does not mean that the individual could transfer them, but that's a whole nother issue right now. It's another point that I was going to make about that. So as you can see, like a construction supervisor might have a harder time winning the case than a construction worker would because he has those transferable skills. That's why higher skilled individuals have a bigger burden, really. That's the bird. A bigger burden of proof to meet than a lower skilled or unskilled. So remember, even if you can't go back to your old job, the SSA may say that you can still do other work based on those skills. So from the SSA's perspective, the skills come from the past relevant work. And again, that's in the last 5 years, not the past 15 years, which is what it used to be until recently. And the skills that you learned, you had to have learned, it has to be the kind of skill you had the time to learn on that job, not just at the job. So let's say you started a managerial job, but you only lasted 2 months, probably not enough time to learn those skills. Because the higher the skill, the longer it takes. Some of them take years. They're documented as taking, I guess, vocationally documented as taking years to gain those skills so that you could then say, you're a skilled whatever. There's some examples of transferable skills I can give you. Communication is one of them. That could be customer service job, teaching, or sales. There's organizational skills. That could be office work, managing schedules. You'll notice on the work history report, they ask about some of these things. They have a question on there about who you interacted with. I forget if that's page 1 or page 2. I think it's page 1 because each job has 2 pages now. And they might even mention about scheduling if one of your duties was managing schedules. There's also technical skills. And this would include typing, data entry, and machine operator type of things. Leadership and supervision is another skill overall, and that's more broad, right? As well as decision making and record keeping. So keep that all in mind. When you describe your job, you have to describe these things if they were so. One thing I would probably do, let's say you supervise people intermittently throughout the day by checking on them. And that was your job as supervisor. Then if you only did it 5 minutes 4 times a day, that's 20 minutes a day. Is that of enough substance, substantially enough during each day to have been a developed overall skill to be able to do that in such a broad fashion? That might be an argument I might make when I know the person, particularly if the person was like a hands-on supervisor. They were actually doing the same work as their team. It was almost like they were like a team lead. They just had this seniority, so they're the supervisor. There's a lot of those, and that is something to grab onto. That it wasn't that I was just this, ivory tower supervisor. I was a hands-on working team member, and just because I was there long enough is why I took on these roles. It could also be that sometimes the supervisory role gets rotated. Don't they have that with nurses? Like you got charge nurses and all that kind of stuff. So it can vary. But things to keep in mind, because if you did it full time, if you are supervising all day long as an ivory tower with your finger, that's going to be a harder thing to defeat, to say you can't supervise for a living. If you're only doing it 20 minutes a day, I'd make the argument that you really didn't gain the skill of doing it all day long. It was so intermittent and minor on the job. Necessary, but very small part of the day. And how the SSA decides if skills transfer, this gets complicated actually. They do look at the past job duties. So when you describe, this is why the work history report is so bloody important, to do it properly and express it properly and not be sloppy and quick. Ideally, you'll have someone who knows what they're doing helping you. They look at the level of skill in those jobs. And we mentioned this before, unskilled, semi-skilled, or skilled. And then, of course, your vocational information such as age, education, as well as your physical and mental limits. So skill level, unskilled would be simple, basic, simple tasks such as a fast food worker. I want to say, I think they say you could learn it with just a quick showing. Semi-skilled is some training, and you have to have a little bit of judgment that you exercise, and that could include a cashier or a home health aide. Skilled is specialized knowledge or leadership, such as a nurse, accountant, a lawyer, a doctor, and many others, of course. I would say managers that are not necessarily doing hands-on work most of the time and managing very in the background or sporadically, like that supervisor, very intermittent supervisor I was talking about. Other kinds of managers could be skilled for sure. It's important to note too that people that are over the age of 50 get greater protection because the SSA assumes that it's hard for them to adjust to new kinds of work. To put that in a maybe in a anecdotal kind of way, I look at myself, I'm in my 50s still, not for long though. And I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for over 30 years, I guess. Back when I became a lawyer, I did some financial analysis before that with my undergrad, a couple years before I went to law school. Always wanted to be a veterinarian, just didn't really want to go to that school, believe it or not. And then I went to law school anyway. And science maybe wasn't my thing. I don't know. But I always look back and go, yeah, when I think about adjusting to other work, which would involve that transferring skills also, I always say, in my 20s, had I gone to, say, med school, I probably could have done it, working hard, of course. But I had the capacity. My brain was more of a sponge. It could learn faster, quicker. I could kind of cram things, all that kind of stuff. At this age now, it would be completely not the same thing. It would be, I probably couldn't do it at all. And if I did, it would be a long-term struggle and I need a lot of accommodations. So am I more stupid? Not really, but the ability to grasp new things, new nebulous things, things outside of what my brain already has, like whatever, those little pathways of knowledge, I can do the Social Security upside down. It's just very familiar, even with the ever-changing landscape. But to go to a totally different field like that, it would never, ever work for me, And I think that's true of probably most over 50s, with the exception of some really rare individuals who are quite unique and impressive. And I do think they exist, of course. But just to say, like even the people in high skilled jobs doesn't mean they could adjust to other work. It just is the way it is. And the SSA recognizes it. And I do believe that there's a write-up for those over age 60. It's really supposed to be 55 and above, but I thought I saw something with reference to 60. I think I did something recently on it. But That's really important fact to know for all the high skilled people that are otherwise thinking they're going to lose their cases because they have these transferable skills. So let's just give an example. Let's say you were Mary, who's a nurse, been a nurse for 20 years. She has a back injury and she couldn't lift patients anymore. I have a lot of these clients. The SSA looks at her nursing background and decides that she has transferable skills in record keeping, communication, and medical documentation that could be used in less physical jobs, such as case management, telehealth reviews, that kind of that triage type of stuff. That where you're not actually you're really more like asking the questions and finding out what's going on. So that person could very well be found to be able to do other jobs, even though she can't do her and other skill jobs, even though she can't do her job as a nurse in the way she did it, like hands-on nursing. Now, and that could be, if you think about it, if someone's in it for 20 years and they started at 22, they're only 42. They would probably lose if you had, barring other major impairments that would impede all these other jobs too, just based on the fact that she can't physically do the nursing. Now, if she was in her 50s, let's say she was 55, 56, it could be a whole new ballgame, both because of the grid that applies to that and the policy, the SSA policy, that her ability to adjust to other work, the work has to be super, super similar, et cetera, et cetera. So she would have more of a chance if she's over 50. Let's put it that way. Note also that transferable skills, sometimes they help a claim and sometimes they hurt a claim, the whole concept. And it really depends on the situation. Every case is very fact specific, as you can imagine, not just in terms of the vocational profile, but in terms of the medical, impairment related limitations and how significant they are. So if you're a pro se and you're dealing with this and you're talking about your past jobs, be really clear about what they were and the duties that were required. Describe the daily duties in detail on the SSA forms, but also those things that were not required daily are really important if they are required for that job. There are some jobs where you don't have to do something daily, but at the end of every week, you have to do this. And if it's something that's far more arduous than you could do, or even if it's like a mental cognitive thing that you could no longer do. But generally, we're usually talking about the physical, the exertional. You're going to want to make sure that's in there too, not just the daily, but the less frequent requirements, such that if you weren't able to do that, you are not going to be able to do that job because that job entails that weekly thing you have to do. It's really important that if, one of those old jobs during that 5-year past relevant work period required heavy lifting or medium lifting, you have to really emphasize that. How much, depending on your age and which grid you might fall into, is what weight of lifting you need to make sure you show if it was so. So even if you fancied yourself a supervisor, but you had to do some lifting, like if you're an assistant manager or supervisor at a fast food restaurant, that's not going to be an unskilled job like the workers. However, you probably also had to do a lot of taking the garbage out, lifting boxes of produce, you know what I mean? And those things can weigh 35 pounds. Now you're up to medium level work. You're way above light level work. And that would be implicating for a person who's 52, 59, 60, all ages, in terms of if you can't do that kind of heavy lifting now, that would at least meet that part of the grade for you. So it's very important to never forget that even though you maybe, we're proud of your title as a supervisor, it's really important to hone in on those physical things, or else you're going to put a fork in your case. Yeah. I mean, I deal with the work history report with my clients generally in detail. Nowadays, we have this more detailed work history report that we have to provide, and I think it's better than the old one. It does ask all these questions and gets to the nitty gritty. So the cases that I know, it helps because now I don't have to reiterate the whole thing in part of my memo so excessively, because now the statement and description of that job is already in there. I don't have to kind of take an extra step later on in the case to get that in front of the judge so that they can properly quantify and qualify the past relevant work you had to find that you can't do it anymore. All right. So remember, transferable skills is your ability gained from your past work that can sometimes be used in other jobs, not always, though. Like we said, sometimes those skills that are deemed transferable by their very nature are not transferable by you because of it could be anxiety and concentration. You wouldn't be able to focus enough to even kind of grasp most of that old information you had in your head to transfer it to something else while you're doing a sit-down job. Really important. And that is why when you have anxiety or depression or anything, it's really best to start treating for it. So those records will show that you complain about perhaps the lack of focus that you have, which most people have when they suffer from anxiety and actually depression. Even if it's not something that disables you entirely from being able to do things, it could prevent you from doing that past job because it's just too much. Let's see. Yeah. So again, SSA doesn't just ask you, can you work? They want to know, can you use your past skills in a new kind of work? So understanding the transferable skills is a really, really important concept you have to get a grip on, particularly if you're self-representing, and you need to be able to tell your story about why you can't do those jobs in a coherent manner and kind of in the language that the SSA needs it, because you want to make sure that the SSA sees the real picture of what you can and cannot do. So that is the basics of transferable skills. I hope it was clear. When you look, if you ever go and look at the grids, and they have them gridded out, and Jonathan Ginsburg has a great page where they're all laid out. You know, for sedentary, if someone's limited to sedentary, which criteria would end up with making them disabled versus not disabled? Light, how about that? And then it goes on. Generally, we're only looking at sedentary and light work because that's the only one that's really going to have a practical impact on cases. But it's worth taking a look at. So, and you'll see right in there, transferable skills, no transferable skills. And so you have to know whether yours are transferable. Aren't. And like I said, there's two ways to prove there's no transferable skills. The job doesn't have them, because some jobs don't, or the person, due to medical reasons, would be unable to transfer them. Or another reason, I'm not sure yet. The reason I say that, I'm not sure that if being illiterate or not speaking English would count as being unable. It's not a medical reason, but it's a practical one. Let's see. There was one other point I wanted to make, but I can't think of what it was. Yeah, I think that's it. All right. Ciao for now, guys. I will talk to you later. I hope this helps. Bye.